الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. أستغفر الله. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. كذلك الله ربي. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده.
سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. أستغفر الله. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده.
سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. أستغفر الله. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سبحان الله.
سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده.
الله أكبر. أستغفر الله. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إنه ليس لي علم بموضع رزقي، وإنما أطلبه بخطرات تخطر على قلبي، فأجول في طلبه البلدان، فأنا فيما أنا طالب كالحيران، لا أدري في سهل هو أم في جبل، أم في أرض أم في سماء، أم في بر أم في بحر، وعلى يدي من ومن قبل من، وقد علمت أن علمه عندك وأسبابه بيدك، وأنت الذي تقسمه بلطفك وتسببه برحمتك. اللهم فصل على محمد وآله، واجعل يا رب رزقك لي واسعا، ومطلبه سهلا ومأخذه قريبا، ولا تعنني بطلب ما لم تقدر لي فيه رزقا، فإنك غني عن عذابي، وأنا فقير إلى رحمتك. فصل على محمد وآله، وجد على عبدك بفضلك، إنك ذو فضل عظيم.
Inshallah, we'll be starting Dua Kumail after Surah Al-Fatiha مع صلاة على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء، وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء وخضع لها كل شيء وذل لها كل شيء وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء وبأسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء يا نور يا قدوس يا نور يا قدوس يا نور يا قدوس يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تهتك العصام اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقام اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعام اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تقطع الرجاء اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبته وكل خطيئة أخطأتها اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك وأستشفع بك إلى نفسك وأسألك بجودك وكرمك أن تدنيني من قربك وأن تزعني شكرك وأن تلهمني ذكرك اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خاضع متذلل خاشع أن تسامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانعا وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجته وعظم فيما عندك رغبته اللهم عظم سلطانك وعلى مكانك وخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرة ولا لقبائحي ساترة ولا لشيء من عملي القبيح بالحسن مبدلا غيرك لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك. Together. ظلمت نفسي ظلمت نفسي ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي اللهم مولاي كم من قبيح سترته وكم من فادح من البلاء أقلته وكم من عثار وقيته وكم من مكروه دفعته وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرته اللهم عظم بلائي وأفرط بي سوء حالي وقصرت بي أعمالي وقعدت بي أغلالي وحبسني عن نفع بعد آمالي وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بخيانتها ومطالي يا سيدي فأسألك بعزتك ألا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي، ولا تفضحني بخفي ما اطلعت علي من سري، ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملت في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي. وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في الأحوال كلها رؤوفا، وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا. إلهي وربي من لي غيرك، إلهي وربي من لي غيرك، أسأله كشف ضري والنظر في أمري. إلهي ومولاي، أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسي، ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي، فغرني بما أهوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء، فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعض حدودك، وخالفت بعض أوامرك، فلك الحجة علي في جميع ذلك، ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاؤك، وألزمني فيه حكمك وبلاؤك. وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي، معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا مستغفرا منيبا مقرا مذعنا معترفا، لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني، ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة من رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري وارحم شدة ضري، وفكني من شد وثاقي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني، يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني، يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني ورقة جلدي ودقة عظمي. يا من بدأ خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي، هبني لابتداء كرمك وسالف برك بي. يا إلهي وسيدي وربي، أتراك معذبي بنارك بعد توحيدك، وبعد ما انطوى عليه قلبي من معرفتك، ولهج به لساني من ذكرك، واعتقده ضميري من حبك، وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك. هيهات، أنت أكرم من أن تضيع من ربيته، أو تباعد من أدنيته، أو تشرد من آويته، أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته. وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي، أتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك الساجدة، وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة وبشكرك مادحة، وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة، وعلى ضمائر حوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة، وعلى جوارح سعت إلى أوطان تعبدك طائعة، وأشارت باستغفارك مذعنة. ما هكذا الظن بك، ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك. يا كريم يا رب، يا يا كريم يا رب، يا كريم يا رب. وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها، على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه، قليل مكثو، يسير بقاء، قصير مدة. فكيف احتمالي للبلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها، وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه ولا يخفف عن أهله، لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك. وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض يا سيدي، فكيف بي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل الحقير المسكين المستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي، لأي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها أضج وأبكي، لأليم العذاب وشدتي أم لطول البلاء ومدتي؟ فلئن صيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي وربي. صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وهبني. صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجاء عفوك؟ فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا، لئن تركتني ناطقا لأضجن إليك بين أهلها ضجيج الآملين، ولأصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولأبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين، ولأنادينك أين كنت يا ولي المؤمنين، يا غاية آمال العارفين. Together. يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين.
يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين ويا إله العالمين، أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفته وذاق طعم عذابها بمعصيته وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يضج إليك ضجيج مؤمل لرحمتك ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي، فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلمه النار وهو يأمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يحرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوته وترى مكانه؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفه؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدقه؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا ربه؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في عتقه منها فتتركه فيها. هيهات ما ذلك الظن بك ولا المعروف من فضلك ولا مشبه لما عاملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك. فباليقين أقطع لولا ما حكمت به من تعذيب جاحديك وقضيت به من إخلاد معانديك لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما وما كان لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما. لكنك تقدست أسماؤك أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين. وأنت جل ثناؤك قلت مبتدئا وتطولت بالإنعام متكرما. أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها وبالقضية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها وأن تهب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمته وكل ذنب أذنبته وكل قبيح أسررته وكل جهل عملته كتمته أو أعلنته أخفيته أو أظهرته وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارحي. وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم وبرحمتك أخفيته وبفضلك سترته وأن توفر حظي من كل خير أنزلته أو إحسان فضلته أو بر نشرته أو رزق بسطته أو ذنب تغفره أو خطأ تستره. يا ربي يا ربي يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي يا من بيده ناصيتي يا عليما بضري ومسكنتي يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي. يا ربي يا ربي أسألك بحقك وقدسك وأعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي من الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورة وبخدمتك موصولة وأعمالي عندك مقبولة حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا وحالي في خدمتك سرمدا. يا سيدي يا من عليه معولي يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي. يا ربي قو على خدمتك جوارحي واشتل على العزيمة جوانحي، وهب لي الجد في خشيتك والدوام في الاتصال بخدمتك حتى أسرح إليك في ميادين السابقين، وأسرع إليك في البارزين، وأشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين، وأدنو منك دنو المخلصين، وأخافك مخافة الموقنين، وأجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين. اللهم ومن أرادني بسوء فأرده، ومن كادني فكد، واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك، وأقربهم منزلة منك، وأخصهم زلفة لديك، فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك، وجد لي بجودك، واعطف علي بمجدك، واحفظني برحمتك، واجعل لساني بذكرك لهجا، وقلبي بحبك متيما، ومن علي بحسن إجابتك، وأقلني عثرتي، واغفر زلتي، فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك، وأمرتهم بدعائك، وضمنت لهم الإجابة، فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي، وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي، فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي، وبلغني مناي، ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي، واكفني الشر الجن والإنس من أعدائي. يا سريع الرضا، يا سريع الرضا، يا سريع الرضا، اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء، فإنك فعال لما تشاء. يا من اسمه دواء، وذكره شفاء، وطاعته غنى، ارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء، وسلاحه البكاء. يا سابغ النعم، يا دافع النقام، يا نور المستوحشين في الظلام، يا عالما لا يعلم، صل على محمد وآل محمد، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله، وصلى الله على رسوله والأئمة الميامين من آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وآله الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. So we were speaking about the Holy Quran as the first source of ijtihad and fiqh. And when it comes to literature, any literature, you want to understand it, you want to derive from it. You have to have a, as we've called it, zahir meaning, a meaning that stands out, that you take from that literature, and you base your judgments on, and your understandings and conclusions on. And this is something that is discussed in hermeneutics and also in usul al-fiqh as well. So we have the Quran as a source. We want to understand from it and derive from it. And so we want to establish a zahir meaning for the verses that we go to, a meaning that stands out, that we can say everyone understands from, okay? That understands from the Quran that same meaning. That's what everyone's after. But there are sometimes some obstacles, as was discussed before, to establishing a zahir meaning for the Quran, okay? One of those was the fact that there's a chance that there was tahrif. We had the discussion on tahrif and the alteration of the Quran. If there's alteration in the Quran, then we can't ever be sure that a verse that we put our finger on, that we go to derive an Islamic law from, was not altered. And so we're always in this perpetual state of doubt regarding the zahir meaning of that verse. We can't establish a zahir for that meaning, for that verse. Another problem we talked about last session was the discussion of qira'at and those different recitations of the Quran, which is a big one, right? And there's a lot of discussion there. Now, alhamdulillah, I said that the Shia don't have to worry about the other relevant discussion to qira'at, which was the ahruf sab'ah, the 7 letters, right? That's something more you'll find in the Sunni school of thought. But the qira'ah problem is there. And talked about how they've kind of solved that one as well. So that's also something that can be an obstacle to establishing a zahir meaning for verses of the Quran. And before I move into our topic tonight, one thing I forgot to talk about last week, or bring up last week, was the fact that, yes, we have the 7 or 10 famous and widely accepted qira'at of the Quran, but the one that is the mainstream one right now, the one that everyone uses, even the Qur'ans that are printed in Saudi Arabia right now, the qira'ah that you find there goes back to a person by the name of Hafs, and he is relating from someone by the name of Asim, who's relating from somebody else who relates from Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. So the qira'ah that we have today, even in the Qur'ans of Saudi Arabia, right? It's not a Shia thing, okay? Is the qira'ah of Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam. And those qira'at, the 7 or 10 that we do have, it's not like that's the only one that's a Shia one. There's other ones as well in those 7 or 10, let's call it canonical qira'at that are out there. So that was just an interesting point I thought I'd bring up that I forgot to mention last week. All right, so now there's another little issue that needs to be discussed as well. And I say little, but I shouldn't say little because it's not that little. And that is the matter of mutashabih versus muhkam verses. Once again, if you want to establish a zahir meaning for verses, you have to make sure that the verse that you're dealing with, they'll say, is not a mutashabih verse. What does that mean? Well, they say that the Quran, it's not that they say the Quran has. The Quran itself says that I have 2 types of verses in Surah Al-A'raf. We'll get to that, or Surah Al-Imran. Before that, I just want to give the definition of muhkam and mutashabih. And as I've written there in the slide, muhkam is that which can not be misunderstood. Okay, it's obvious, it's just one meaning to this. Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allah is one. Okay, you can't really misunderstand this. There's no confusion when it comes to this verse. But there are other verses that might be a little unclear what is meant by them. They can be misunderstood. For example, the famous verse of Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. The verse attributes a hand to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are some today that believe God does have a hand. In the Muslim ummah, they believe. But others will say, no, this is a metaphorical verse. When we run this verse by other verses that are muhkam, that talk about there's nothing else there's nothing out there like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that lets us know that even when it says Allah has a hand, it's being metaphorical. It's a famous verse. And we've talked about this before, maybe in other sessions that we've had. So there's a muhkam, cannot be misunderstood. Mutashabih is a verse that can be understood. The Arabic that they brought, this is from Tamheed of Sheikh Hadi Ma'rifah. He says, المحكم من القول أو العمل من سدت عليه مسارب الشبهة فيه. That muhkam is that which there's no vulnerability when it comes to that statement or that action even. There's no vulnerability there where you can actually go through that and poke in holes into it and put shubha and doubt in that statement or in that action, right? So when it comes to like قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, okay, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, you can't poke any holes in there. It's obvious what is meant by it. It's a muhkam verse. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There's no one like Allah. Well, it's an obvious verse. The meaning is pretty clear. You can't really poke any holes in there, cause any doubt in regards to it. But yadullahi fawqa aydihim, no, there's chances of shubha being injected into it, misunderstanding it. It can be misleading. Now, this is a Quranic sciences discussion. It's not a fiqh and ijtihad discussion. Once again, I'm repeating what I've said before, that when we're discussing these Quranic discussions, in reality, they are mostly Quranic sciences, not fiqh and ijtihad. But because they're related, because the Quran is also seen from a fiqhi ijtihadi perspective as a source of ijtihad, these discussions will come. From the point of view that, can we establish a zahir meaning from it, from the Quran? Because if we can, then we can use it for ahkam and deriving fiqh and law. But if we can't establish a zahir meaning, then we have a problem. We can't go to it. So this is also one of those obstacles, muhkam and mutashabih. I do want to say this, that there are a ton of opinions on what mutashabih means. Okay? Now I keep saying misunderstanding, confusing, misleading, that which can mislead. But what's the difference between a verse that's vague versus a verse that's mutashabih? Is there a difference between these two? For example, the verse that speaks about a person by the name of Dhul Qarnayn, the possessor of two horns. Who was this? First of all, what does possessor of two horns mean? Was it that he had a helmet with two horns on it, like, the Vikings? Or is it that something else is meant here, like he actually had grown two horns, like he had something to do with Illuminati? No, astaghfirullah, he was a righteous individual. You know what I'm saying? He was a righteous individual. He has nothing to do with that. It's not real horns, probably. What is it? Okay, now, even if we figure out what the horns are all about, who was this person? Who do we identify him with? The Quran doesn't tell us. So is this mutashabih because we can't figure it out and identify? Another example. إِنَّمَا النَّسِيءُ زِيَادَةٌ فِي الْكُفْرِ. The Quran speaks about something called nasi'. What if someone doesn't know what nasi' means? It says nasi' is an extra kufr in addition to the kufr that people have. An additional kufr and disbelief in God is nasi'. What is nasi'? Well, back then they would move around months of the year, because you all know, out of the 12 months of the year, 4 of them it was forbidden. Even during the time of Jahiliyyah and before Islam, forbidden to fight and have wars and battles. Okay, so now, sometimes they would move these months around in their own interests. This was haram. And Allah condemns it even in the Quran. What if someone doesn't know what nasi is? This concept of nasi. Does that make this verse mutashabih now? Not necessarily. These will be more on the side of verses that are unclear in their meaning and they need tafsir. While the opposite of mutashabih, or that which they use as a solution for mutashabih, is not tafsir. What do they say? They say you have to do ta'wil of the verse. Okay, so these are different things here. I don't want us to think that anything that's unclear equals mutashabih. No, unclear can sometimes be called mujmal. Okay, and it just has some vagueness to it. You have to figure that out through tafsir. But ta'wil, for example, when I say yadullah fawqa aydihim, everyone knows the meaning of hand. Everyone knows Allah. What is going on here then? What is meant here? There's a ta'wil here, not necessarily a tafsir here, they'll say. Okay? So I'm just trying to point out how Quranic sciences will go deep into these discussions to be able to identify mutashabih from mujmal. From something that's vague, from something that is mutashabih. Alright? But for now, and for this little class that we're having, our definition is going to be that which can be misunderstood versus that which cannot be misunderstood. So now, the verse of the Quran that is causing all these issues for us is Surah Al-Imran verse 7, where it explicitly says that the Quran has 2 sets of verses. Let's read the verse. It says, "It is He who has sent down to you the book." Parts of it are mutashabih, or muhkam verses. Now the translations will say definitive. Okay, we'll take that for now. which are the mother of the book, while others are metaphorical or mutashabih. Okay? It says mother of the book. What does one do with one's mother? We always run back to our mothers, right? We go back to our mothers. They are our source. They are our origin. They are where we go to find peace and calm and tranquility in. After we go to them, all problems are solved. To our mothers, inshallah. Now, here also it says there are some verses that are like the mothers of the book. Meaning what? That other verses that have issues, they'll go back to those. Once they go back to those muhkam verses will explain them in a way that will understand them, what is really meant by them. But there are some people who don't do this. It says, as for those in whose hearts is deviance, they pursue what is metaphorical in it, pursuing fitna and courting a personal interpretation of it. When you can interpret verses to your own interest, why not? You'll get away with anything that you want. Imam Ali in the battle of Nahrawan, or when he was dealing with the Khawarij, what did he do? He sent Ibn Abbas to argue with them, to debate them. But he did tell Ibn Abbas one thing. It's famous. He told them, when you go to them, argue with them with the sunnah of the Prophet, not with the Quran, because they can interpret it and twist it and turn it any way they like to their own benefit. But with the sunnah of the Prophet, it's more specific. You can win the argument with that. So yeah, the Quran will have some verses that can be interpreted for your own personal benefit. But this here, it says they are after fitna, these people who do this. But no one knows its interpretation. So these mutashabihat, now the verse is saying, there are two groups of people, or let's not say two groups, but there's two entities out there that will have the understanding to understand the interpretation of those mutashabihat. Who are they? But no one knows its interpretation except Allah and those firmly grounded in knowledge. Ar-rasikhuna fil ilm. These are the ones who can interpret these verses. Other than these ones, no one else can. And of course, the best example of ar-rasikhuna fil ilm is the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, correct? What do they say? These people who are ar-rasikhuna fil ilm, they say, we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord, and none takes admonition except those who possess intellect. Meaning what? Meaning this verse, you're reading this, but whoever reads this verse, the only ones who will take heed are the ones who possess intellect. The other ones, they don't care what these verses are saying. Alright, so that's where this idea of muhkam and mutashabih comes. So if there's mutashabih, brothers and sisters, it means that we can't understand it properly. We might misunderstand it. And if there's a chance of misunderstanding, that means we cannot establish a proper meaning for the verse. And if you cannot establish a proper zahir meaning for the verse, what does that mean? That means you cannot use that verse anymore. This is the problem. If you are a mujtahid and you know that there's a muhkam and mutashabih in the Quran, that's going to be an obstacle for you. The moment you identify a verse as mutashabih, that means you have to stay away from it, right? We'll talk about that. Or not even identify a verse as mutashabih, but rather there's a verse that there's a chance this might be a mutashabih. The moment there's a chance that this is a mutashabih verse means I'm not confident enough to say that this has an apparent meaning that I can follow, a zahir meaning. We have problems. And so there's three types of opinions here that we're going to go through very quickly and give a very basic answer to of what these opinions are in this regard. If we can go to the next slide. Some have said that it isn't possible for there to be any mutashabih verses in the Quran. They're like, the Quran is a book of guidance. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put mutashabih verses in there? Yeah? And so the answer that's given, and this by the way, this challenge that is put out there, they use this a lot when it comes to different subjects. The Quran is a book of guidance, so we should be able to understand all of it. And so this guy has some crazy interpretation of the Quran because he believes every verse can be interpreted by them. No, not necessarily. Don't worry. Just because there's mutashabihat in the Quran doesn't mean that we're in trouble. The answer says that out of the 6,000 something verses, only 200-ish, now according to Ayatollah Ma'rifat, only 200-ish of them are mutashabih. That leaves us with another 5,800 verses. If you can't get the message of the Quran out of those 5,800, we're in trouble, yeah. Okay? But trust me, the message of the Quran is pretty clear. in the 5,800 other verses. Even with the mutashabih verses, you can still tell it's about guidance, it's about akhirah, it's about Allah, it's about fearing Allah and all that kind of stuff. Oh, who cares if I can't understand what yadullah definitely means and necessarily means? Okay, I'll just put a question mark on that one. All right, so that's one. But the second question, the answer that I forgot to put up here, I have to fix that later. The second answer also is that, look, when it says the Quran is a book of guidance, it means it's the main source, it's the main reference, right, for you. Whenever you have issues, you go back to it, or you go to the experts who know this book in and out. Okay, so yes, the book is a book of guidance for all of us, correct, but when it comes to the intricacies, when it comes to the details of things, you have to be an expert of it. Now, this answer isn't saying, hey, the clergy are the only ones you go to. Bismillah, you want to be an expert? Go do the work, and then you can be an expert. I can't have a medical doctor, for example, coming to me and saying, this verse is about medicine. I can't have that. Study the Arabic language, have your proof for why this verse is talking about this or that, and then we can discuss in an academic circle and setting. But if you can't prove what you're saying in an academic setting, usually what you're saying isn't going to carry that much weight and value. Okay? So what the second answer is saying is that, yeah, it is a book of guidance, but it's like that dictionary you put in your bookshelf where wherever you get stuck, you go back to it, and if you can't understand, you'll ask somebody else. It's that kind of thing. So yes, it is that main reference, that main source of guidance, but it doesn't mean that every single detail is accessible to anybody. The main message is accessible to everybody. Tawheed, prophethood, qiyamah, and how you have to work for your qiyamah and your afterlife, how there's a heaven, there's a hell, there's a resurrection, unlike what the kuffar said during the time of the Prophet. They said there is no resurrection. Okay, like 1/3 of the verses of the Quran they say are about resurrection. What are you talking about? Okay, so this message is clear. But then I want to say, the book is a book of guidance, so I should be able to figure out who Dhul Qarnayn was. Habibi, relax. Right? Even the greats haven't figured it out yet. And this guy's like, I think it's Alexander the Great. Well, he might be great, but you ain't great in what you're saying. So that's one opinion. They say it's impossible for there to be mutashabih verses in the Quran. There's another opinion, the flip side. You always have extremes on both sides. The extreme on this side, though, says, no. All of the verses of the Quran are mutashabih. Don't you just love them akhbaris? Right? Now, this is according to different books I looked just to make sure, because I don't want to hate on a group when it's not true. But Ayatollah Ma'rifah is saying this, Tabatabai is bringing this up, and even another book that I looked at also was bringing it up. So there is this opinion out there, and they say it's the opinion of the akhbaris, who will say, look, the whole entire Quran is mutashabih, and it can all be misunderstood. And so we have no other choice but to put it kind of aside. Now, we talked about this before, of course, the Akhbari school of thought. We talked about this before. So they had Muhammad Amin Astarabadi, who had 9 reasons why you can't go to the Quran. Then you had Bahrani, who brought hadiths that said the Quran can only be understood by the Ahlul Bayt. This might be a third reason why you can't go to the Quran, which we didn't cover there, but here we can see it because it's relevant to our subject. That it says you can't go to the Quran, not because of those 2 reasons necessarily, but this third reason. What is the third? Because it is mutashabih, and the Quran says don't try to figure out mutashabih. Okay? The answer to that, very simply put, is that if your reason that we cannot go to mutashabih is the verse of the Quran that says don't go to the mutashabih, that verse itself is mutashabih according to you. Yeah? You get it? Let me repeat that. If you're saying the Quran in its entirety is mutashabih, and the reason for this is that verse that is telling us that there's mutashabihat in the Quran, then that verse itself is a mutashabih verse according to you. So we can't even follow that verse that says don't go to the mutashabihat. So we have to go back we have to step back one step before we even go to the Quran and see if we can go to the Quran or not. You can't use this verse to prove that you cannot go to the mutashabih, because according to you, all verses are mutashabih and we can't go to them. Okay. And of course, there's other discussions here as well that we're going to be skipping. There's a lot to unpack in all of this that we are skipping. We're just trying to scratch the surface so that we understand and appreciate what the maraji have to do to come up with one little ruling that in the end I'm just going to say, oh, I don't think that's relevant to me today, and I put it aside. This person has to spend all this time and effort and energy to figure these things out for us to say that we think it's not pertinent to our day and age. All right. But then there's an in-between approach here. Not the one that says, no, it's impossible for there to be mutashabih. Or the one that says, no, all of them are mutashabih. It says, look, the Quran is clearly telling us that some verses are muhkam, some verses are mutashabih. And so we know that for sure. And because some are mutashabih, we know that we're not allowed to follow some of the verses of the Quran. That's what we're going to come up with. But the answer to this is also pretty clear. Because this person now is saying, I can go to that verse that's talking about mutashabihat. I can go to it. And it is telling me that some are mutashabih and I cannot follow them. The answer to that is that same verse is telling you you can follow mutashabihat. But there is a condition or some conditions that have to be met. Okay? Should I run it back real quick? Let's run it back again. This third group of people say that, look, the verse is clearly telling us there are some muhkam verses, some mutashabih verses. And the verse is telling us we can't follow mutashabih, so we'll just follow the muhkam verses, which are many. Answer, the verse never said, don't follow mutashabihat. The verse said, don't be after fitna and personal interest when you're interpreting these verses. That's what it said. So, if there happens to be a mutashabih verse that we identify, we have to understand it in light of the muhkamat. Either we get help from other verses, or we get help from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the Imams, if they have explained a verse that is mutashabih and they've clarified it for us. And this brings me to what Allama Tabatabai says here. Let's read what Allama Tabatabai says. He very clearly says that this is the case. That look, you either have a muhkam in and of itself verse, a verse that is inherently muhkam, and then you have a mutashabih verse. It's in and of itself, it's mutashabih. But if you take this mutashabih, understand it in light of other muhkamat, this mutashabih transforms into a muhkam. But not a muhkam on its own, but rather a muhkam by virtue of another muhkam. Okay? So you have mutashabih in and of itself, but muhkam because of something else. All right? This is important. And let's read what he says now. He says what is meant in the verse by mutashabih is that the verse is such that one will not understand what is meant by it upon hearing it, but rather will be undecided between different meanings until they refer it back to the muhkamat. So the muhkamat explain and determine what is meant by them. As a result, the verse goes from being mutashabih to being muhkam by virtue of the muhkam verse. Okay, so muhkam transforms into mutashabih, transforms into muhkam. By virtue of the muhkam verse it went back to, while the original muhkam verse is muhkam in and of itself. Okay? I think that's pretty clear and self-explanatory. So Tabatabai is of this opinion that, yeah, we can go back to mutashabihat. Now, that is a mufassir of the Quran. Although, of course, Tabatabai, he was an allama, he was an expert in all fields. They don't look at him, though, as a marja or a faqih. He's not known for that. Although, of course, everyone knows he was a great of a faqih. But if you also want to look at what a faqih even says in this regard, Ayatollah Udhma Khu'i, rahmatullah alayh. What does he say? Next slide. What he says also clearly is the same thing. He says, and by the way, I have to correct myself. I checked his al-bayan fi tafsir al-Quran. Remember I said he started tafsir? Ayatollah Khu'i started tafsir but never finished. When I looked at it, it went into Fatiha, Surah al-Fatiha, but he never made it to Surah Baqarah. So he's just in Surah Fatiha. But the thing is that that volume that he started, he goes into a lot of Quranic sciences first as an introduction. So that volume is all about tafsir al-Quran and the Quran and these discussions that we're having. Then he goes into Surah al-Fatiha, but then he never continued it. So just wanted to correct that, make that correction. So Ayatollah Khu'i, he says in Al-Bayan, in the intro, he says, mutashabih isn't an unclear term itself. All right? So we know what mutashabih means. Stop getting confused on mutashabih. Although I do want to say in parentheses here, Ayatollah Khu'i, even mutashabih, we're not sure what is meant because there's like 16 opinions Tabatabai brings in his book. So we'll just go with what you're saying right now. You say it's unclear, it's clear in and of itself, fine. mutashabih, he says, is not an unclear term itself. It means for different meanings to be a possibility for a word or sentence, with all of those meanings being equal in possibility. That's why you don't have a dhahir meaning anymore. Dhahir means the one that stands out. 70, 80%, 90%, this is what is meant. All right? When this word or sentence is used, one isn't sure what is meant by it, and so they cannot draw any conclusions from the verse. And so they do tawaqquf, it's called. Tawaqquf is when you stop. You don't come to a definitive conclusion until there are other specifying clues determining what is meant by the verse. Based on this, a word or sentence that has a dhahir meaning doesn't even fall under the category of mutashabih to begin with. This is very important. This last line, very important. I'm going to conclude with this. The problem with like the akhbaris, for example, or anyone else who had a problem with mutashabih versus muhkam, was they thought mutashabih equals that which we're not 100% sure what the meaning of it is, right? And they were excluding, I want you to pay attention to this last line, okay? They were excluding dhahir from muhkam. They were saying muhkam is only that which you're 110% sure, like there's no other meaning to it. Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allah is one, okay? That which has a dhahir meaning, 80, 90% I'm sure what is meant, that's mutashabih. That was the mistake they were making. While these people, like Ayatollah Khuwi, what are they saying? They're saying mutashabih, and Tabatabai had the same thing. Mutashabih is that which has like 3, 4, 5, 6 meanings, whatever. And we're not sure which of these it is, and they all are equal in the possibility. Dhahir meaning means 80, 90%, that's what it's meant. Mom, dad calls you up, says, hey, go buy meat today. We need meat. We're out of meat. You go and you buy some beef, you come home, they slap you across the face. Why'd you buy meat? Why'd you buy beef? Did you know turkey is also a type of meat? Like, mom, dad, like, the only time meat will bring the meaning of turkey to my mind is, you know when? In November. Thanksgiving time. That's the only time, if you go buy anything other than turkey, you get called out. But throughout the year, when you say meat, 80, 90%, what is meant by meat? Beef. Worst case, what they meant by meat was chicken. Right? Even then they'll say chicken. Can someone call chicken meat? Yeah, they can. It's not wrong. But what is the dhahir meaning of meat? In a sentence, when they tell you, hey, go buy meat. What is the dhahir meaning? What stands out? What is meant 80, 90%? 80, 90% what is meant is beef. Okay, and goat as well. It's fine. We'll add goat to the thing as well. We don't do that in Iran. We do sheep. You guys do goat. These are referred to as meat. Finished. This meat is dhahir in beef, right? It's dhahir in it. These guys say, well, this is also mutashabih because there's a chance that turkey is meant. While Ayatollah Khuwi, Tabatabai, these ones, they say dhahir is not even applicable. If you have a dhahir meaning, the whole muhkam versus mutashabih discussion is out the window. We know what is meant here. And Allah will hold us responsible if we don't go and act upon the verse that has a dhahir meaning. Just like you'll get in trouble with mom and dad if you don't go to buy meat. And they say, why don't you buy meat? You're like, I wasn't sure if you meant turkey, sheep, or goat. Like, Baba, throughout the year, what are we eating? It's obvious what we're eating throughout the year. We're eating beef or meat or goat or whatever it is. That's what is meant by it. So these are just examples, of course. These are just examples. That's how the fiqh works. And so, with that, mutashabih and muhkam also is not going to be an issue. Muhkam and mutashabih. If something's muhkam, no problem. If something's mutashabih, we refer it back to the muhkamat, we figure it out, and all of a sudden, here we are with that mutashabih, which is now muhkam by virtue of another muhkam. That's all if we don't have a dhahir meaning. If we have a dhahir meaning, the whole discussion just goes out the window. We don't even need it because dhahir meaning has nothing to do with mutashabih. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Any questions before we end? Yeah. Are there any examples? I should have looked that up. I didn't look it up. Yeah, that's a good thing. I wish I had an example for you of cases where we have a mutashabih verse regarding Islamic law, where we need to refer it back to some of the muhkamat. There won't be too many. There will not be too many. If there's only 500 verses, as they say, and claim only 500 verses in the Quran that have to do with Islamic law, on one hand. And on the other hand, according to Ma'rifah, he said, out of the 6,000 plus verses, only 200 of them are mutashabih. I highly doubt there will be too many verses that are ahkam related that are also mutashabih. Yeah. But these are theoretical discussions that have to be figured out anyway. Okay, but I'll look into that. If I can find something, I'll share it with you. Yeah. Of mutashabih for fiqh or just in general? Yeah, he does. I mean, there's a lot of it, and I gave some of those examples, but once again, I didn't do a deep dive into this discussion because it's a Quranic sciences discussion. Yeah, we don't need it too much. We don't need to dive in too much. Yes. You go ahead and now. Yeah. According to these ulama, I would say they believe zahir, those things that have a zahir meaning, also fall under muhkam. Yeah. Because their definition of mutashabih was what? Different possibilities, equally possible. When you have a zahir meaning 80-90%, so it doesn't fall under that definition, so it's under this category. It's because you have this dichotomy here. It's either this or that, you know? Yes, sister. These are answers that are usually given to those akhbaris or those ones who had those extreme views. These are all the same. I mean, Ayatollah Sistani for sure will follow the footsteps of Ayatollah Khouei in this regard. If anyone says anything other than this, usually it's kind of looked down on when it comes to the Quran. Yeah, that's my understanding. So you're making a chain here now. You're saying we have a muhkam in and of itself, a mutashabih in and of itself. This mutashabih does fusion with this muhkam verse and becomes a muhkam by virtue of that muhkam. Can this now secondary, let's call it muhkam, help another third mutashabih become muhkam? I would say, yeah, of course. Yeah, why not? Anything else? All right. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. توجه زيارة. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام على الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة. السلام على 9 المعصومين من ولد الحسين. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب الزمان. عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.